From the point of view of the criminal expert,
said Mr. Sherlock Holmes,
London has become a singularly uninteresting city since the death of the late lamented Professor Moriarty.
I can hardly think that you would find many decent citizens to agree with you.
Well, I must not be selfish,
said he, with
the community is certainly the gainer, and no one the loser, save the poor out-of-work specialist whose occupation has gone.
At the time of which I speak, Holmes had been back for some months, and I at his request had sold my practice and returned to share the old quarters in Baker Street. Mr. Sherlock Holmes was leaning back in his chair after his whimsical protest, and was unfolding his morning paper in a leisurely fashion, when our attention was arrested by a tremendous ring at the bell. As it opened there came a tumultuous rush into the hall, rapid feet clattered up the stair, and an instant later a wild-eyed and frantic young man, pale, disheveled, and palpitating, burst into the room.
"I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes,"
he cried.
"You mustn't blame me. I am nearly mad. Mr. Holmes, I am the unhappy John Hector MacFarlane."
"Have a cigarette, Mr. MacFarlane?"
said he, pushing his case across.
"I am sure that, with your symptoms, my friend Dr. Watson here would prescribe a sedative. You mentioned your name, as if I should recognize it, but I assure you that, beyond the obvious facts that you are a bachelor, a solicitor, a Freemason, and an asthmatic, I know nothing whatever about you."
"Yes, I am all that, Mr. Holmes, and in addition I am the most unfortunate man at this moment in London. For heaven's sake, don't abandon me, Mr. Holmes! If they come to arrest me before I have finished my story, make them give me time, so that I may tell you the whole truth."
"Arrest you,"
said Holmes.
"This is really most gratty, most interesting. On what charge do you expect to be arrested?"
"Upon the charge of murdering Mr. Jonas Oldaker, of Lower Norwood."
Our visitors stretched forward a quivering hand, and picked up the Daily Telegraph, which still lay upon Holmes's knee. "If you had looked at it, sir, you would have seen at a glance what the errand is on which I have come to you this morning." Underneath the vigorous headlines which our client had quoted, I read the following suggestive narrative. "Late last night, or early this morning, an incident occurred at Lower Norwood which points, it is feared, to a serious crime. A safe which stood in it was open, that a number of important papers were scattered about the room, and finally, that there were signs of a murderous struggle, slight traces of blood being found within the room, and an oaken walking stick, which also showed stains of blood upon the handle. The police theory is that a most sensational crime has been committed, that the victim was clubbed to death in his own bedroom, his papers rifled, and his dead body dragged across to the wood stack, which was then ignited so as to hide all traces of the crime." It was a clang of the bell, followed instantly by heavy steps upon the stair. A moment later, our old friend Lestrade appeared in the doorway. Over his shoulder I caught a glimpse of one or two uniformed policemen outside.
"Mr. John Hector MacFarlane,"
said. Our unfortunate client rose with a ghastly face.
"I arrest you for the willful murder of Mr. Jonas Oldaker, of Lower Norwood. I think there will be no difficulty in clearing it up,"
said Lestrade grim.
"None the less, with your permission, I should be much interested to hear his account."
"Well, Mr. Holmes, it is difficult for me to refuse you anything, for you have been of use to the force once or twice in the past, and we owe you a good turn at Scotland Yard."
"I must explain first,"
said,
"that I knew nothing of Mr. Jonas Oldaker. His name was familiar to me, for many years ago my parents were acquainted with him, but they drifted apart."
He had in his hand several sheets of a notebook, covered with scribbled writing. "Here they are," and he laid them on my table.
"Here is my will. I want you, Mr. MacFarlane, to cast it into proper legal shape."
I set myself to copy it, and you can imagine my astonishment when I found that, with some reservations, he had left all his property to me. He was a strange little ferret-like man, with white eyelashes.
"Remember, my boy, not one word to your parents about the affair until everything is settled. We will keep it as a little surprise for them."
He was very insistent upon this point.
"One moment,"
said.
"Who opened the door?"
"A middle-aged woman who was, I suppose, his housekeeper. I was shown by this woman into a sitting room, where a frugal supper was laid out. Afterwards Mr. Jonas Oldaker led me into his bedroom, in which there stood a heavy safe. He showed me out through his own French window, which had been open all this time. I could not find my stick, and he said,
"Never mind, my boy, I shall see a good deal of you now, I hope, and I will keep your stick until you come back to claim it."
"Not until I have been to Blackheath."
"You mean to Norwood?"
Strayed.
"Oh yes, No doubt that is what I must have meant,
said Holmes with his enigmatical smile. Holmes had picked up the pages which formed the rough draft of the will, and was looking at them with the keenest interest upon his face.
There are some points about that document, Lestrade, are there not? That it was written in a train. The good writing represents stations, the bad writing movement, and the very bad writing passing over points. A scientific expert would pronounce at once that this was drawn up on a suburban line. It strikes me, my good Lestrade, as being just a trifle too obvious,
said.
You do not add imagination to your other great qualities, but if you could for one moment put yourself in the place of this young man, would you choose the very night after the will had been made to commit your crime? My first movement, Watson,
said he as he bustled into his frock coat,
must, as I said, be in the direction of Blackheath.
And why not Norwood?
It's all going wrong, Watson. All as wrong as it can go. I kept a bold face before Lestrade, but upon my soul, I believe that for once the fellow is on the right track, and we are on the wrong.
He was more like a malignant and cunning ape than a human being.
said she.
And he always was, ever since he was a young man.
She produced a photograph of a woman, shamefully defaced and mutilated with a knife.
That is my own photograph. He sent it to me in that state, with his curse, upon my wedding morning.
This place, Deep Dean House, is a big modern villa of staring brick, standing back in its own grounds, with a laurel-clumped lawn in front of it. To the right and some distance back from the road was the timber yard which had been the scene of the fire. They had spent the morning raking among the ashes of the burned wood pile, and besides the charred organic remains they had secured several discolored metal discs. I examined them with care, and there was no doubt that they were trouser buttons.
Yes, she had let Mr. McFarlane in at 9:30. She wished her hand had withered before she had done so. She had gone to bed at 10:30. Her room was at the other end of the house, and she could hear nothing of what had passed.
An open telegram lay upon the table. It was from Norwood and ran as follows: important fresh evidence to hand. McFarlane's guilt definitely established. Advise you to abandon K. Lestrade.
Well, Mr. Holmes, have you proved us to be wrong yet? Have you found your tramp?
He cried.
I have formed no conclusion whatever,
My companion answered. With dramatic suddenness he struck a match, and by its light exposed a stain of blood upon the whitewashed wall. As he held the match nearer I saw that it was more than a stain. It was the well-marked print of a thumb.
Well, then, will you please compare that print with this wax impression of young McFarlane's right thumb, taken by my orders this morning? That is final,
said Lestrade.
Yes, that is final.
I involuntarily it,
it is final.
said Holmes. An extraordinary change had come over his face. It was wreathing with inward merriment. His two eyes were shining like stars. It seemed to me that he was making desperate efforts to restrain a convulsive attack of laughter.
Dear me, this is a very sad development, Watson, is it not?
Said he.
And yet there are singular points about it, which hold out some hopes for our client.
I am delighted to hear it.
Said I heartily.
Only this, that I know that that mark was not there when I examined the hall yesterday. And now, Watson, let us have a little stroll round in the sunshine.
Finally, on the top corridor which ran outside 3 untenanted bedrooms, he again was seized with a spasm of merriment.
There are really some very unique features about this case, Watson. Don't you think it may be a little premature? I can't help thinking that your evidence is not complete.
What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?
Only that there is an important witness whom you have not seen.
5 minutes later, 3 policemen had assembled in the hall.
In the outhouse you will find a considerable quantity of straw,
said Holmes.
I will ask you to carry in 2 bundles of it.
I did so, and driven by the draught a coil of gray smoke swirled down the corridor, while the dry straw crackled and flamed.
Now we must see if we can find this witness for you, Lestrade. Might I ask you all to join in the cry of fire?
Fire! We all yelled. It had hardly died away when an amazing thing happened. A door suddenly flew open out of what appeared to be solid wall at the end of the corridor, and a little, wizened man darted out of it, like a rabbit out of its burrow.
Capital,
said Holmes calm.
Watson, a bucket of water over the straw. That will do. Lestrade, allow me to present you with your principal missing witness, Mr. Jonas Oldecker.
No harm. You have done your best to get an innocent man hanged. If it wasn't for this gentleman here, I am not sure that you would not have succeeded. I could not speak before the constables, but I don't mind saying, in the presence of Dr. Watson, that this is the brightest thing that you have done yet, though it is a mystery to me how you did it.
When I paced one corridor and found it 6 feet shorter than the corresponding one below, it was pretty clear where he was. I thought he had not the nerve to lie quiet before an alarm of fire. The thumb, Mark Lestrade? You said it was final, and so it was, in a very different sense. I knew it had not been there the day before. Therefore, it had been put on during the night. When those packets were sealed up, Jonas Oldacre got McFarlane to secure one of the seals by putting his thumb upon the soft wax. It was the simplest thing in the world for him to take a wax impression from the seal, to moisten it in as much blood as he could get from a pin prick, and to put the mark upon the wall. It would strike him that in disappearing he might throw all pursuit off his track, and at the same time have an ample and crushing revenge upon his old sweetheart if he could give the impression that he had been murdered by her only child.
It was a joke, my good sir, practical joke, nothing more.
He whined incessant.
And you'll probably find that your creditors will impound the banking account of Mr. Cornelius. By the way, what was it you put into the wood pile besides your old trousers? A dead dog, or rabbits, or what? Well, I dare say that a couple of rabbits would account both for the blood and for the charred ashes. If ever you write an account, Watson, you can make rabbits serve your turn.